here. I'm choosing this position from the French advanced variation as the starting point of this video. You can't pick everything for every video, so this is what I'm choosing. I'll backtrack, show how we get into this position, and also show some sidelines along the way, which will be the subject of other videos. You can't cover everything in every video. So, okay, here we are. French defense. Response to the king pawn opening, black plays e6. It's a passive looking move. It traps in the light square bishop, but you get some counterplay with it and clear tactical lines. And I think it's useful to show the French defense oftentimes from the white perspective because that requires a little bit more finesse, I think, whereas black's plan tends to be really clear. Okay, so here's the idea of the French defense. You counterattack with d5, which forces white to make a decision about the pawns. You could play the French tirage, you could do the classical, you could do the exchange. Let's say you choose the advanced variation. He counterattacks with c5. Most theoretical, you play c3. Black is the first to bring out a piece. And then you also bring out your piece. This is known as a Paulson attack when you play knight to f3. And the most aggressive response to the Paulson attack is queen b6. Here you could play a6, for example. You could play bishop to d3 with some very good winning chances. I chose a classical variation, bishop e2. And then here is the point where black will often exchange the pawns in the middle by taking pawn takes d4, and then you might take back with the pawn. What would happen if black plays knight to h6? Here I think that you would want to take the knight off the board, and now black could take your bishop, and then you would play queen to d2 in this position. So a sample line could run where he plays his bishop on the diagonal, you castle, he castles, and you bring your knight out to a3 with the idea of bringing your knight out to c2. If the pawns get exchanged in the middle, you might advance b4, or you might bring your knight to e3. That will be the subject of another video. In this video, I'm going to look at if instead of taking the bishop, the queen takes b2 with the idea of taking the rook. Here, one option, white could play queen d2, and black would not want to change the queens off the board because you could just retake the queen with a piece that's under attack, and white is winning here. So instead in this position, black would take your rook off the board, and then after you castle and he takes your bishop and you play the knight to a3, the queen would have to trade itself for the rook. And it's a super interesting position because white doesn't have any rooks, but black doesn't have a queen. So this will be the subject of another video also. There's so many things to say about it. But what I'm going to look at in this position is what would happen if white played his bishop to e3. This does not exactly trap the queen, but I think white has good chances here in a lot of lines. So, all right, what will happen if queen takes a1? The queen is going to want to take the rook one way or another. Otherwise, why did he give up his knight? There would be no point. In response to the queen takes, I recommend you put your queen as white on c2. And now this queen is starting to feel claustrophobic, starting to feel trapped. So how will white make sure that the queen doesn't get trapped when white castles and then the knight comes to d2 to attack the queen? So black would probably want to change, give this bishop here, the dark square bishop, some scope. So the bishop can come to a3, and then the queen can respond by coming to b2, and either trade itself off or maybe escape to something like b6. All right, so if the pawn takes, it would be a mistake, I think, as white to take with the pawn because this bishop check is very annoying. The king would have to sidestep, and it'd be very hard to get this rook in the board. The bishop takes on d4, I think is a little bit more of a subtle mistake. I'll return to that. So the best move here is actually knight takes d4, and if black, for example, were to play his bishop to a3 right away, it would be a mistake because knight to b5 is strong with a threat, playing to c7 and winning the rook, and also attacking the bishop. So if black were to castle here, which might be the best move, you could just take the bishop off the board, which is why black would be better to take the knight off the board to stop this threat on b5. So also you should say that black takes e5 will be another kind of mistake, because white could play knight to b3, and that also traps the queen. And black might not have anything better here than to just trade the queen for a knight. And that would be a sort of mistake, because this dark square bishop can come here, the light square can come here. I mean, it's a losing position for black. Okay, so black takes the knight off the board, you retake with the bishop. Again, you don't want to take with the pawn because bishop b4 is a very troublesome check. And now you can see that that bishop's sort of pointing at the queen. Here, black would play bishop to a3 to help free up that queen. And now white would want to check, but doing this check, bishop b5 check. You wouldn't want to castle here, because when queen comes to b2, this check is really no longer possible, because you could take, and the queen, escapes. So you want to put in that check first, and now black would be best to sidestep. Now you can castle, and black would have some options here. You could play bishop b2, or you could play queen b2. Let's say queen b2 happens first. Now queen to a4 is an extremely strong move, because queen to a5 would be a very devastating check. And also you're attacking the bishop here. So if the bishop, for example, were to just run away and try to save itself, then queen a5 would come. Black would have no choice but to block with the pawn. You take the pawn with the bishop, you take with the queen. And that's actually a checkmate. So that's losing. So black's best option here, actually, and it's a move that's very hard to find, is bishop to b4, which now defends the a5 square. So you wouldn't probably here as white want to take with the queen, because even though you've gotten your piece back, if you follow this line, if bishop comes to d7, for example, and you bring your knight out to c3, it's very playable, and white has good chances, but it's not the best that he could do. And also, you wouldn't want to take with the pawn, because the queen could take your bishop, which is the idea of that. So the best response for white is rook d1, defending the bishop. And now the engine recommends that black would play bishop to d7. It doesn't look like a very good move, but I think part of the reason is that there's not anything else that is appealing at all, because the bishop has to defend the square, can't move, the king doesn't have many squares to go to, there's not much to do with these rooks. So the idea here, after the bishop plays to d7, is that white could make a mistake. He could take the bishop with the pawn, and now when the bishop recaptures, the queen has a threat. And so if the queen takes, now the black queen can perhaps move out of the way and gain some scope. So that wouldn't be the best way to play. Instead, you'd be better taking, and then he would throw his bishop on a5, which is an odd-looking move because the bishop's not defended. But if you take, he could take you back, which is the idea. So you might maybe throw your bishop away for a pawn before you recapture, and then the king runs away. White, I think, is better in this line, and this is with black even playing some pretty exact moves. So I would think that after rook d1 that the game is actually a little bit tactically lost for black. Okay, so what would happen if in this position instead black played bishop to b2? Well, after queen to a4 with the same sort of threat, black is very short on moves on what to decide to play. So if he played, for example, this bishop move, throwing the bishop away with the idea that maybe the rook has a little bit more scope, black could, that's not an appealing move. I don't know if your opponent would actually play that. Maybe the king would run instead to a move like e7. Well, the idea here is that white would play knight to d2, attacking the queen. Queen doesn't have any squares, but the bishop can come in the way. Now the knight would fork the queen and the bishop, and perhaps the queen would slide over to b1, and when you take the bishop back, the queen can at least jump out of the way. Maybe the queen would instead come to something like f5. So that would maybe be the idea here. But the queen is sort of on the wrong side of the board. Your queen could come to something like b4, and then black is very short on options. You could just even go queen to d6 and checkmate. So that position, I think, too, is tactically lost. And there's a lot more nuance here than I'm giving it credit for. For example, after the fork, the queen could instead come to b2. And then maybe you would even want to slide over to b4 to put in this check before you take the bishop off the board. The queen, if instead you go back a little bit and the queen comes to a4, I think black really might be best playing bishop d7. So when you take the bishop off the board and the king does a move like sliding over, and then you go through this this tricky little move here, and you take the queen off the board, maybe the queen could come to d3 because you've thrown your bishop away in order to remove this bishop off the diagonal. That's an option also, but again, I don't think it's particularly strong for black because you can always just harass the queen. Maybe the queen instead would want to come to e4, but you could always do a check of some kind to trade the queens off the board if the opportunity arises to do it. It wouldn't be good in that particular situation. Okay, so what would happen if after this check, instead of the king sliding over, the bishop comes in the way, which I think is less exact because after you trade the bishops off the board, queen to a4 comes with a check, so you've gained a tempo here. And if, for example, the king jumps back, you can castle. Now if you do the same maneuver with the bishop, and the bishop jumps in the way, and you fork, and then you attack, and then the queen comes to perhaps at e4, you could actually just move your knight to c5, attacking the queen and threatening checkmate at the same time. So there are lots of threats in this position, which is why I think bishop to b2 is not the best move. But it's hard to think that other moves are better, because if the king jumps away and you castle and the queen instead comes to b2, you can always take that bishop off the board. And now the queen still doesn't have any active squares to go to, and there's still lots of threats in this position. The queen, for example, could come to a5. So even if the rook were to slide over or something similar to that, you could always take this pawn off the board because the rook slid over. So I think that would be how white would play in this position here. Now let's backtrack just a little bit. What would happen if, going all the way back, instead of the queen taking, after bishop comes back to e3, which is really the starting point of the video, instead of the queen taking the rook on a1, what would happen if you start to exchange the pawns in the middle of the board first before taking? Now white actually sort of has an option. The queen could come to b3 instead. So maybe you take the knights off the board first, and now queen would come to b3, which is a little bit more of an active square than c2. So the queen has come to b3. If black doesn't pay attention to what's happening here, and you castle, and he just brings out the other bishop, knight to d2 is going to force black to just trade his queen for the rook. And unlike that other position, that other line that I sort of showed at the start, there's actually less counterplay for black in this position. So I don't think that's winning at all. So the correct recipe after queen to b3 is pawn to a5, castle, pawn to a4, harassing the queen, so the rook can come to b2. or b8 rather, and the queen can come out. So after knight to d2, queen to b2 is an option. And now, in this position, you could take on a4, threatening the pawn here on c6. And then you could perhaps even put your rook on b1. And now the queen couldn't slide out of the way because it doesn't have any squares to go to except to take this pawn, but then you'd lose your rook. So the queen would probably trade itself off for a rook and a knight and a check. You could defend perhaps with the bishop. That's a very interesting position also, but I think white has good chances. Okay, so let's see. Let's go back. Okay, so what would happen if you played queen to b3 before taking that knight off the board? I think this is less strong because black can counterattack with knight to a5, forcing your queen to come back, and you've sort of lost the tempo for nothing. Now he could bring his bishop out before you castle. That's an option anyway. Knight to b3 is no longer an option for you in this position because his own knight has that square under observation. Okay. Let's see. I know I'm flying through some of these positions super fast, but there's a lot of nuance, and so I think in order to have a good positional understanding of the game, you have to explore all these different positions where the features might be just slightly different from each other in different versions. Okay, so queen takes off the board, you move your queen to c2. What would happen if he takes your pawn, you take with the knight, and instead of taking the knight off the board so that it can't come to b5, what would happen if black put his bishop on d7? Here, if you go knight to b3, black could actually respond with knight to b4, and if, for example, you took the pawn, he could take your pawn back with check, the king would have to step out of the way, and the queen frees herself by taking on e5. And I think black is a very playable position here, actually. And so white made some inaccurate moves to lead to that. So I think better here, when the knight comes to b4, is to take the queen, so when he takes you back, you take back with your knight. And I think white has a much more solid position here than he did before. Okay, so if you go knight b3 here, black could also perhaps take the pawn at this point, because if you were, for example, to castle, he could pin your knight with bishop to a4. And that would be a very annoying pin, because now if you take the queen, he takes you and you take back. That's an option too here. Let's see, the correct move order here though is after you do that, you would have to, as black, play knight to b4. You couldn't, in this position, play knight takes. So the correct move order is after bishop d7, then you might perhaps castle, and now he could perhaps take you, knowing that this move b3 would be replied to with bishop a4. However, after you castle, there's no reason white would have to play knight to b3. White could instead play knight to, after you castle, I apologize, castle, then knight takes e5. You would actually just in this position play knight d2, forcing the exchange. And I think white has some good chances in this position also. Okay, so let's go back. In this position here, after queen takes the rook and queen comes to c2 and you take, now you can see why bishop takes on d4, perhaps not such a strong move, because bishop to a3 can no longer be met with knight to b5, so when you castle, the queen is sure to escape. So now here you probably just trade the queens off the board. Okay, very cool. So those are those lines. I hope this video is helpful. Another video I'd like to look at is what would happen if these central pawns are traded off the board, and now the knight comes to h6. and you take the knight off the board, and the queen takes on b2. This is interesting because it's a little bit more of a gambit line. It kind of looks a little bit more like a mistake, like it's inaccurate, because if you move your knight here, for example, he takes off the board and you castle, he could take. Now in this position you might move your rook to b1, he might take your bishop, put you in check, you take, and then he might run with his queen to something like a3. And you could move your knight here with the idea of coming again to b5. And these are different lines. They're more like gambit lines, where white will be down a pawn or perhaps 2 pawns, but get a nice counterattack. Okay, awesome. Bye.